right. We good to go? All right. We start on time. 4, 3, 2, 1. Good. Live from Gaithersburg, Maryland. Welcome, everyone. My name is Vicki Pilitary. I'm a computer scientist in the Computer Security Division here at NIST. Welcome to the webcast on the NIST Risk Management Framework. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Ron Ross, the one and the only, I'd like to go over some housekeeping and logistics for this webcast. We will be taking Q&A from our participants, both via email and through Twitter. The email address is sec-cert@nist.gov, and if you want to tweet at us, tweet at US-NIST-Gov, hashtag NIST-RMF. If you are experiencing any technical issues with the sound or the video, etc., with the webcast, please direct those questions to webcast@nist.gov. This webcast will be recorded and will be available for playback within 2 weeks of the event. The slides are available online already. We have allocated time at the end of the webcast for questions, but it's very unlikely we'll be able to answer all of your questions live. So if your question is not answered during the webcast, the NIST team will follow up with you in the coming week or 2, or maybe 3, depending on the volume of questions, through email or via private message on Twitter to respond. Again, the slides that are posted actually have more slides than we'll be presenting today. They'll include slides on more details on the supporting risk management framework publications. Those slides are marked with an asterisk. We will not be covering those today, but those are available to you as a resource. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce the one, the only, Dr. Ron Ross to kick us off today. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki, very much. First, let me start out by saying thank you to all of the staff who helped get this webcast on the road today. It's a lot of work to do these, but I think we're going to be able to bring you some great content today. I also want to take, and by the way, we broke all records with this webcast. We have over 4,500 people signed up for the webcast today, so we're bringing all of these people into our virtual house today. And before we kick off the content, I wanted to take this opportunity to say a thank you and a special goodbye to one of our really important people on the FSMA team she's been with me for 10 years. Many of you out there on the webcast today have worked with Kelly Dempsey over the years. She's going to be retiring in about 2 or 3 weeks. And this is her final event that she's going to be doing today as part of the panel on the RMF. So she's been in federal service for 38 years and started out her career in the United States Air Force, was in the Department of Defense for a long time. So, Kelly, I just wanted to publicly thank you for your service to the country. Thank you for all your service to NIST, and especially to the FSMA team. You really have, you've been the co-pilot for a long time, and we wish you well, and thank you for everything you've done. So, I just wanted to do that before we got started. We have a lot to cover today. Vicki told me that I have 15 minutes, and she will tackle me if I don't finish in 15. So I hope you hold to that. So I want to start out with a story. When my kids were young, I was in the Army. We traveled a lot, and we would go around the country, and they loved roller coasters. And every summer, we would jump in the car, and we would travel the country going to all kinds of roller coaster parks. And some of the parks were the big ones like King's Dominion or Six Flags, but then you'd occasionally run through a small town with a very small county fair roller coaster or just a really, really small mom and pop operation. And of course, as parents, we always were concerned, I want to make sure those roller coasters are safe because I'm putting my kids on the coasters. The big ones always were safety first. They were doing everything, but sometimes you would go to a very small park and you'd see a roller coaster, and you go up and you talk to this guy. He's usually about 65 or 70 years old, and you say, "What kind of safety features checks did you put on this roller coaster?" You look at you like you were from another planet. I would look at my wife with concern. We'd look down at the kids. They would smile at each other, and they would run to the roller coaster and get on. That's the world and we let them do that. The reason I tell this story is because today we are on a roller coaster of highly untrusted software, firmware, hardware, and systems. And we're building the most complex information technology infrastructure ever to be known to mankind. It does awesome things. And we're like those kids, my kids, your kids on the roller coaster. Look at the smartphone, look at the tablet, look at your laptop. You're just in awe of the technology. Meanwhile, everything going on below the surface, all of that hardware and software and things that make that capability come alive, much of that is not trusted today. And we are in an environment that is very, very dangerous with cyber adversaries that are doing everything they can to either steal intellectual property, national secrets, everything that they can get to in our computers today is in play. It's kind of like a cyber combat zone. And we have to have all of our citizens and our agencies and our Fortune 500 companies and our small mom and pop companies all operating and trying to survive in this type of a world. And so I give you all this background because RMF 2.0, and yesterday I saw a tweet from some young lady who said, you know, RMF, don't use all the acronyms. Most of us, have not done this our whole lives. So it's the Risk Management Framework 2.0. That's the shorthand for the 800-37 Revision 2. I tell you all this because RMF 2.0 represents literally 10 years, about when Kelly came onto the project, that we've been looking at how RMF 1.0 has been operating. We've observed how people use it, how people misuse it. What are some of the shortcomings that were in the original framework that we needed to fix? And I want to thank everybody on the webcast today and all of our customers out there because we work for you. And you've helped us bring together what I would argue is the most powerful and functional risk management framework anywhere in the world. It does things that other frameworks can't do. This framework has integrated so many things into a single risk management process and framework. We have the original risk management for cybersecurity. We still do that. But we now have integrated privacy into the same framework. We've also brought in supply chain considerations to manage supply chain risk, manage privacy risk. This is critical because our enterprises operate as one entity, and senior leaders have to do a lot of heavy lifting every day. They have to manage all kinds of risks. And when you give them stovepipes they have to operate in, that makes their life a lot more difficult. So we have made their lives a lot easier today because we're giving them one framework to do a lot of different things. In addition to the integration of privacy and security and supply chain into that framework, we also have inserted a new step in the traditional 6-step RMF, and you're going to hear all about that today in the deep dive. It's the preparation step. Now, those of you who have read our 839 publication, we have a triangle that represents what typical organizations look like. And it's got 3 levels in that triangle. It's got the organization level, it's got the mission business process level, and it's got the information or the system level. And that's the way most organizations are structured. One of the big failings of RMF 1.0 is that we didn't always connect up tier 1 or level 1 with level 3. The implementers and the operators are doing their thing, but many times the senior leaders will acknowledge the security or the privacy issues, but they're not directly involved in organizing from the top, the governance aspect. And I've said many times, most of our failures today in cybersecurity and possibly privacy come from 3 things. We need strong leadership, good governance, and accountability. And those 3 things are not really on the top of everybody's list. And when you go back and look at every serious breach, you can usually trace it back to a failure of one of those 3 things. So the organizational prep step is our way of bringing strategic thinking into the risk management process. We've got a lot of good tactical stuff going on. We've got tools and techniques and controls and assessment procedures. but yet there was not good communication and feedback from the top of the food chain all the way down to the implementers. I call that the RMF 2.0 operates from the boardroom down to the SOC, the Security Operations Center. And that is a very powerful concept that we want to make sure that everybody understands going forward from today. The other thing we did, very important, many of you have used the cybersecurity framework for the last 4 years. That cybersecurity framework now, we've aligned every place in the risk management framework that we can with the cybersecurity framework. So if you want to use that framework, you'll be able to see where those different activities in the CSF align with things in the RMF. The next and most, I think one of the most important things that we've done in RMF 2.0 is align our systems security engineering guidelines with the risk management framework tasks. Now, why is this important? We've talked a lot about the world that we live in today. We operate in two worlds, kinetic space and cyberspace. And when you're operating in that world, many of the things that go on below the waterline in the hardware, the software, the firmware, and the systems are well beyond your reach. And so it's very important that we bring back that concept of integrating cybersecurity and privacy considerations into the risk management framework so it can be part of the life cycle. And in fact, that's one of the complaints that people had. They said, you know, we go through the whole process, we want to launch the system, and then we have to get the authorization. It takes us a year to get the AO to sign off on the authorization document. That should not happen, because if you integrate all of these things that we're talking about all the way through the life cycle, then everything all those artifacts, all the things you're producing as part of the life cycle development should be easily transferable over to the authorization process. Because all you're doing there is you're really giving information to senior leaders so they can make credible risk-based decisions. That's our job. Everything should tie back to the mission or the business of the organization. And that's what the organizational prep step does. It ensures that before the system owners go down the road of implementing everything in that RMF, that the senior leadership is involved from day one. There are certain things that are done at the organization level in preparation for execution. There are certain things done at the system level as you get ready to execute. But all of that comes from those 17 or 18 new tasks in the organizational prep step. So that's what RMF 2.0 brings to the table. Now, the other thing that is really important, 2019 is going to be a very big year for us at NIST. We are literally renovating the entire FSMA house, so to speak. You've seen the start of the renovation with 837 Rev 2. You're going to see very soon the renovation of 853. And we're also adding a few new rooms to the house. So those FSMA documents are going to have a few new things that you haven't seen before. But the point is that the RMF 2.0, that is your foundation. That is the process that establishes whether you are going to succeed or whether you're going to fail your organization in this very dangerous and complex world of information technology and cyber. And today this becomes even more critical as we see the massive convergence between cyber and physical systems. So if you made a mistake in the old days and you didn't pay attention, the worst that was going to happen to you is the blue screen of death. Now, I don't know if any of the younger folks out there remember what the blue screen of death is, but that's when your computer screen goes blue and it crashes. And that was irritating, but nobody died. Today, we're pushing computers, especially in the IoT space, into everything. They're going into sensors. They're going into pacemakers. They're going into automobiles in hundreds of computers. And they're going into everything that we care about that not only is important to us, but can, if we don't do it right, we can see a loss of life or catastrophic effects on our missions and our business operations. So this is serious business. Our adversaries, they mean business. They're bringing their A-game plus at us, and we have to bring our A-game plus back at them. And that's what we're doing with RMF 2.0. We're moving the strategic thinking about cyber security and privacy into the enterprise. And then that will lead to tactical solutions in all the other steps of the RMF. Now, one last example I want to leave you with is last year, the Department of Defense had a very serious cyber attack. One of our adversaries attacked the Navy submarine program, and they stole lots and lots of critical defense critical information. At that time, we had the publication 800-171, and all of you out there who are familiar with that know those are the recommended security requirements to protect CUI, controlled unclassified information, when the information is in non-federal environments, systems, and organizations. There's 110 requirements in 800-171, and people thought that's a lot of requirements. Those requirements are all traceable back to security controls in NIST 853. That's the source. Those 110 requirements are not enough to stop the advanced persistent threat. So one big message of 837 Rev 2, RMF 2.0, you have to look at your assets in two different buckets today. You can't apply all of these controls to everything and try to do everything to the highest degree, or you will fail. You'll run out of money, time, people, and energy. You have to be able to apply the right controls to the right type of situations and assets. The criticality of the assets is very important to understand. And when you separate things into critical things and non-critical things, you can then build security plans that are up to the task of defending your systems and information, your assets against these very high-level adversaries. Now, we've put a new task into 37 Rev 2, RMF 2.0, that allows you to either use the baselines to select your controls, or you can start with a set of security requirements and you can pick your controls based on those requirements. That's a smart way to run an operation. It's very tightly coupled back to the mission and the business. So these are some of the things that you're going to get with RMF 2.0. Now, the point of the 171 story is that the DoD came to us late last year, and we're working with them now to do an update to that publication. There's going to be a new appendix in 171 Revision 2 that is going to have an additional 30 enhanced requirements that are going to deal with stopping the advanced persistent threat for those organizations who have controlled unclassified information in critical programs and high-value assets. You see, that's an example of how you can use the RMF and all the other things we're doing to differentiate between things that matter and things that are nice to have. And unless and until we can do that, we're never going to be able to succeed in this very complex world with massive attack surface, and we're playing defense all the time. We have to seize the strategic and the tactical advantage from the adversary, and we have everything in 853 that we need to do that. So with that, my time is up. I hope everybody has a great time on the webcast today. Vicky's going to have all of our contact information at the end of the webcast, so if you don't get your questions answered today, we'll be around to answer them down the road. Thank you guys very much. Have a great webcast.
Thanks, Ron will be back to join us for the Q&A session. Thank you for your feedback on the noise. I think we're just picking up some noise from the corridor behind the auditorium. With that, I'd like to invite up my panelists, Kelly Dempsey and Naomi Lefkowitz, up and to join me at the table. So you push to talk. Oh, hold on while we have some technical difficulties with the chair. We tested everything but the chairs.
Yeah. That's why we have contingency plans.
Other chairs, yes. All right.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Ron, for your kind words. And it's been great being on the team and helping contribute to developing these publications and contributing to better security across our nation. So I do really appreciate the opportunity I've been given, and I've enjoyed working with everyone. So enough said about that. So here we see on the slide the list of publications. These are the primary publications that we mostly work on that are part of our core to the FSMA project. So we see a big long list there. Many of them are included, well, they're all included somewhere as references if you look at the reference sections within the task. So we'll see that when we look at the task structure. But anyway, those are the pubs that we primarily are focused on and support the risk management framework and the requirements from FSMA, the law, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. So risk, so Ron was alluding to this when he was talking about critical versus non-critical, and another slide I like to have in here, which is not in here, is a quote from a gentleman named McGeorge Bundy that was JFK's national security advisor. And the quote is that if we protect our diamonds and toothbrushes with equal zeal, we will lose more diamonds and save our toothbrushes. So that is not what we want. Obviously our diamonds are critical, so we want to apply more security controls and protect our diamonds more than we protect our toothbrushes. Otherwise we're wasting a lot of resources and things are not going to be how we need them to be from a security perspective. So we see in this slide, risk can never be eliminated, and so that we have to manage it. And we do that by understanding what are our diamonds, what are our toothbrushes, how can we manage security at the appropriate level for a given asset or system. So that's what the risk management framework is all about. So we should keep in mind that it always ties back to managing risk, understanding what our risks are, understanding what our critical and non-critical applications are. So, Ron mentioned our triangle from Special Pub 839, and we see it here. We have the organizational level at the top, and we have the mission business process level in the middle, and the system level on the bottom, shoring up the whole pyramid. So 837 used to be focused more at the system level only, and now, especially with the preparation step, we've taken it up a notch to make sure that things get done at the organizational level as well. And we see with the arrow there that as we move towards the top, the organizational level, we have more of a strategic focus, and down at the system level, we have more of a tactical focus. So 837 Rev 2 published in December, right before the shutdown, so that was unfortunate timing that we could not control, but we did publish it then, and it does provide a holistic risk management process. And so from holistic, I mean from the very beginning of the system development lifecycle, as well as covering all the bases as far as what you need to do to protect your system management, technical, operational, covers everything in there. And in 37 Rev 2, as Ron mentioned, we've integrated privacy. We sort of already had it in the STLC steps, but that's, of course, still in there. We have aligned the cybersecurity framework with the risk management framework, and also with supply chain with the risk management framework. Did I forget anything? Oh, and security engineering, of course. All integrated, all tied together so you can see exactly where you are and where you need to be with each sort of separate process. And of course, as we had before, we have tasks, numerous tasks for each process step. Okay, so the purpose, let me review here. The purpose of 837 and managing risk in general, of course, is that we want to ensure that risk is managed in a consistent way across the organization. So we don't want one group over here doing one thing and one group over here managing risk in another way, using a different process. By using all the same process that we define in the risk management framework, then we are able to have a consistent, standardized process across the whole organization. We want to, of course, ensure that security and privacy requirements that we need to protect our systems are in place, and again, are, managed at the organizational level and the process itself, and integrated into the enterprise architecture and the life cycle. So again, we always show in every task what step of the life cycle you should be in, and if enterprise architecture is a factor in a given task or step. So thank you, Naomi. And then we want to make sure we have more secure information and systems, and more private and secure systems, that we need and that we've defined as part of our requirements. And so the risk management framework gives us an opportunity to have a standardized process for making sure our information is secure and private. And that's really why we're doing all of this, right? That's why we manage risk. That's the primary purpose in my mind, is to protect our information. And we do need to establish responsibility and accountability. So we can't have finger pointing when there's a problem has arisen, when there's an incident. We don't want people going like this. The buck has to stop somewhere. And so the risk management framework tries to establish who's responsible and who's accountable for accepting the risk that gets accepted on the systems. And so that is covered as part of the purpose. And of course, we want senior leaders to have that information, so they're responsible and accountable per the RMF. So how are they going to be provided the information they need to make these risk-based decisions? And the information that's generated as part of the RMF tasks is provided to those senior leaders so that they are able to make those decisions, and so that is crucial. Okay, and now Naomi is going to talk a little bit about how we've introduced privacy.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. We're really going to miss you.
Thank you. We can still find her.
I know. You'll be sorry, because we'll be questioning you all the time. So I think you've heard a number of times now that privacy has been integrated into the RMF. And so you may be wondering, well, what does that mean? And how is that different from security? So we thought it might be helpful to give a little bit of background about how NIST is looking at the relationship between privacy and security. And you will see referenced both in this presentation and throughout 37 references to our NIST IR 8062, which is a foundational document on sort of privacy engineering and risk management concepts. And so in that was, really where we explore this relationship, and we can think of it kind of like this Venn diagram. So there's, an overlap, but these are also independent disciplines. And so, we can certainly see that there's this clear recognition that security of PII, personally identifiable information, plays an important role in the protection of privacy, but that you can see by this that individual privacy cannot be achieved solely by securing PII. And so one way that we can think about it is that, on the security side, we're looking at sort of unauthorized activity or behavior, right? Loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But on the privacy side, we're also looking at, that often organizations are using PII, they're using information intentionally to meet mission or business objectives. And so we can sort of call that collectively sort of authorized processing. And by processing, we mean the full information lifecycle from collection through disposal of PII. And as a result of this, even though the processing is intended for operational purposes, risks can arise almost as a unintended consequence or byproduct of that processing. And so, of course, the goal of risk management in general is always to sort of optimize good, beneficial outputs and minimize adverse consequences. So in this case, we're looking at trying to minimize adverse effects on individuals. And so one of the things that we introduced in NIST IR 8062 is this concept of a privacy risk model, which is already very familiar in the security space, having a security risk model. And is kind of uniformly or widely adopted and agreed upon. Here, this is early days, so we cannot say that this is widely adopted, but we put it out if it's a resource and a help to organizations as they're trying to do privacy risk assessment and apply that throughout the RMF. And so in security, you're probably very familiar with the fact that it's the factors are usually considered what's the likelihood that a threat will exploit a vulnerability and the impact if that occurs. But when we think about it from the authorized processing perspective, we're really thinking about, well, what's the adverse effect? We can think of it as, individuals can experience sort of a range of problems from the processing of their information. And so those problems can range from things like embarrassment all the way up to loss of autonomy or discrimination, economic loss. It can be a whole range, but sort of at the meta level, there is this kind of problematic data action. That is, some kind of operation the system is taking with data creates some kind of problem or a likelihood of a problem for individuals, and then we can think about what the impact would be. So now we can have sort of two risk models and do two types of risk assessments, which we'll certainly be discussing further in this webinar. But this is our way to introduce and give you a little bit of background as we're going through this and we're talking about, hey, security and privacy, to try to keep these two concepts in mind. So with the privacy, with that little bit of background, now we can talk a little bit sort of at a high level about the privacy integration into the RMF. And you may be familiar with OMB's Circular A130, which is a policy for the federal government on privacy and security. And in their last update in 2016, they integrated privacy into that. And so the RMF, and one of the two sort of key points that came out of that is that, one, the policy is now that agencies need to apply the RMF in their privacy programs, and two, that agencies need to manage privacy risk, sort of beyond just compliance risks. And a simple way to say that is compliance risk is really complying with law or policy or requirements, and privacy risk you can think about, there's some overlap, but there's also some sort of delta or difference in terms of, even if you do everything that the law requires, and you still have sort of upset your constituency or invaded their privacy in some way, telling them that you've complied with the law, you can ask that question, will that make your constituents any happier? If the answer is no, now that's what privacy risk is. That's what managing privacy risk is. And so you can see that now in A130, that it's not enough to just manage compliance risk. We really have to think about underlying privacy risks. So this, certainly was sort of our marching orders in terms of integrating privacy into the RMF. And as we go through this, we will, talk more about how we've done that. But you'll see it now. I think the sort of the main point is that what we don't have is, sort of a separate appendix or a privacy considerations section, right, hanging out at the end. Everywhere privacy is fully integrated into all of the tasks, the roles, and additional privacy-specific detail in the various discussions.
As Naomi was mentioning, this update of the RMF really integrates in a lot of other relevant NIST publications that are being used by a broad community of stakeholders, whether it be privacy, whether it be the security engineering community, whether it be cybersecurity framework users, to support our customers who are leveraging both the cybersecurity framework and the risk management framework. This update to revision 2 includes alignment between these two major publications. So now as you're implementing the steps and the tasks of the RMF, there are direct ties to the relevant sections of the cybersecurity framework, whether they be the core, the functions, the category, the subcategories, profiles of the cybersecurity framework. When Kelly covers the new task outcomes table in a few slides, you'll see the direct link to how each risk management framework task is mapped to the relevant element of the cybersecurity framework. So you really, by implementing the risk management framework, you are implementing the cybersecurity framework and then some. Along that vein, the bringing in of other relevant publications to support the risk management framework. The risk management framework has always emphasized building in security, but now we also have this wonderful suite of new publications that I'm sure you've heard Ron talk about only once or twice. The SP 800-160 series, the System Security Engineering. So now we have a direct link to the security engineering publications and processes in those publications to ensure that we build these trustworthy, defensible, and survivable systems from the get-go. As Ron says, it's an engineering problem. It starts even before you begin dreaming up the system. You can't just tack on security at the end. So the whole objective of this integration with the security engineering processes is to ensure that we address security issues from a stakeholder protection needs, concerns, and requirements perspective, and to use these established engineering processes to ensure that these needs, concerns, and requirements are addressed with the appropriate fidelity and rigor early and in a sustainable manner throughout the life cycle of a system. So section 2.4 discusses kind of the concepts from the systems engineering publication, and we also have an appendix at the end of the publication that talks about systems engineering and the SDLC. We've also integrated in supply chain into the risk management framework. Even though we consider supply chain risk as part of security risk, we really acknowledge that it's a really critical element of risk management. Organizations are increasingly reliant on products and systems and services that are provided by external providers to carry out their core mission and business functions. But ultimately, the organization itself is responsible and accountable for the risk incurred when using these component products, systems, and services that are, outside. So the growing dependence on these products and services and systems and components from these external providers presents an increasing amount of risk to the system. So we've made updates to Risk Management Framework 2.0 to ensure that supply chain risk is included as part of the security risk and really called out. We've included relevant links to special publication 800-161, the Supply Chain Risk Management Practices for Federal Information Systems and Organizations, and all of those relevant steps that really call out supply chain, bringing it to the forefront. We've also added supply chain risk management artifacts in the appropriate tasks as both inputs and outputs as applicable, and updated the roles and responsibilities appendix of the RMF to include supply chain risk management responsibilities. Speaking of roles and responsibilities, we have done a comprehensive update of the roles and responsibilities. This section has been expanded to include new roles required by recent OMB memorandum, such as the Senior Accountable Official for Risk Management, to call out new privacy roles that Naomi will touch on, security engineering roles, and increased involvement by the C-suite per the intention of our prepare step. So we recognize that every organization probably has a different mission, has varying missions, business functions, and organizational structures. So there might be different naming conventions, especially if you're not in the US federal government, for what these roles and responsibilities are. But ultimately, at the end of the day, these are specific things that need to be accomplished to ensure that you're managing risk, both security, privacy, and supply chain within your organization. So you can call them chief whatever, just get the job done. So regardless of what you call them, the basic functions remain the same. The application of the RMF in the publication is obviously very flexible, so you can accomplish the intent of these specific roles in various ways. The only thing to really highlight is it's important that organizations ensure that in certain roles there's no conflicts of interest when assigning, say, the same individual to fill two roles. A great example would be we would not recommend that the authorizing official for, say, System A is also the system owner of System A, because then, they have too much skin in that game. Naomi, would you like to touch on some of the privacy roles?
Sure, and I think my main message on this slide is don't panic, right? So this is not meant to be a stress. This is meant to be an aid to begin thinking about. We know that privacy is not sort of as mature a discipline as security, and that the workforce is not as well developed. But we hope that putting out these roles can begin to help organizations think, once they've done their risk assessment and figured out their risks, that they begin to think about the kind of skill sets they need to better manage those risks. And so you may have people wearing multiple hats, and that could be absolutely fine. But we want people to begin thinking about, hey, what are all the different types of skill sets that I could really use, and begin to build that workforce.
Okay, so back to me. We're going to talk now about authorization boundaries, which we still cover in 37 Rev 2. We have it addressed in a section 2.5, and then there's an appendix that goes into authorization boundaries a little bit deeper. So the official sort of definition is that authorization boundaries establish the scope of your system, the scope of protection that is needed for the system, and the components that are part of the system. So this is extremely important. We've made it an official task in the prep step to get those authorization boundaries set. If you don't have your authorization boundaries correct, then again, it's going to lead to finger pointing. If there's an incident, was that my component? Was it your component? Who was in charge of doing this? The buck doesn't have anywhere to stop if your authorization boundaries aren't correct and aren't established, so that everybody knows whose components belong to what system. So that is extremely important, and with that comes the definition of the authorizing official's scope of responsibility. So what is that authorizing official responsible and accountable for? And if the authorization boundary is fluid somehow or squishy, then you're not going to be able to have that responsibility and accountability that is needed to protect the systems and to make sure that someone is accountable, that someone's taking responsibility for what's been implemented, how it's been implemented, and accepting any residual risk. And so, as we see there, we establish our authorization boundaries in the last bullet during task prep step 11. And that is before we categorize our system and develop our system security plans. And if you think about it, that makes perfectly good sense, because if you don't have your authorization boundaries determined, then how are you going to know what information types are processed within that system, processed, stored, and transmitted, and how are you going to develop your security plan? What's the scope of your security plan? Everything, all of that is dependent on determining your authorization boundaries. So some things we consider, nothing really has changed here. There's only so much we can say about how to determine your authorization boundaries. The organizations have to sort of use the guidance that we've given and fit that to their organization. But we see that some system elements to consider when you're doing your authorization boundaries is the system or the system components under the same direct management. And by direct management, we don't mean, we don't really mean anything necessarily. Well, we do, but we don't mean direct management. If you're a system at NIST, you could say, well, the Secretary of Commerce is part of the direct management. It really depends on where you want to draw that line. And so we just say direct management, and that's for the organization to decide what direct management means and where in the organization you draw that line. But in general, it's someone in the mission business process area that you would have on the same direct management under. And that's not coincidentally the next bullet to consider. Does the system or the system component support the same mission or business functions? And so that's one of the criterions. Let's see, process, store, transmit similar information types. So, and by similar, you know, is it supporting the same mission business function? Are the information types, you know, of similar categories as far as low, moderate, and high? Impact for loss, and so that is something to consider. And also, do they reside in the same general operating environment? The same or similar. So again, you can group things together depending on where they're living in an operational environment, and that could be a factor in your authorization boundary determinations. But overall, organizations have very wide latitude in setting their authorization boundaries. So the trick is to get it right, so you don't have too many components in as part of a system, and that you have to find that balance of what's correct as far as what the boundary is and what the authorizing official is responsible for, but also what makes sense. So you don't want to you know, have a very, very large and complex system that maybe is better off being divided into different systems and different boundaries. So finding a balance there with your authorization boundaries, considering those system elements, and also authorization boundaries should be an organization-wide activity. So this shouldn't really be occurring. It is a system-level thing, but it should always be in conjunction with the mission business process level and probably even the organizational level, so that everybody's clear about where the boundaries are, how the boundaries have been established. But again, we're looking at those mission business requirements, security and privacy requirements, and the costs to the organization with respect to potential loss. So that's always a consideration as part of risk management anyway. And here we see the conceptual view of the system that we have in 37 Rev 2 now. Inside the triangle or diamond is the system. So the dark boundaries around the triangle is your system boundary. So all of your system elements that are within that authorization boundary are inside that triangle. And then we have some other systems. We have our enabling systems that might be providing common controls for the system. They might be providing database functions for the system, you know, some sort of other systems that are outside of the boundary that that are enabling the system in some way. Again, either that's common controls or from a security perspective or a privacy perspective, or functionality enablers. So, you know, again, it could be a database, it could be who's the organizational system that's providing common controls for authentication to the system. So, and then we also have other systems that there might be some sort of loose interaction with, and those are also outside the boundary. And then we have the environment of operation, and the environment of operation could be inside or outside the boundary of the system, depending on what the organization decided. And so if the system is living in in an operation environment that someone else owns and manages, then they're probably going to be and should be inheriting common controls from that environment of operation. If the environment of operation is in the system boundary, then of course it would all be addressed in that system security plan. And here we have the new wheel of FSMA, and it includes the prep step there in the middle and in gray, and so the outside circle around the outside that's also gray, that shows us what publications we might be needing to help us as references to complete the prepare steps. And so we have that then in the blue circle around the middle that addresses the references for the existing 6 steps that we previously had. And of course, when we again see the task structure, we'll see that there's a list of references that all of these and probably others are included.
Just as a note for folks on the webcast that have downloaded the slides from the site, you will see supplemental slides that go into depth about each of these publications. Due to time, we're not going to cover those slides, but those are available to you as references.
Yes, exactly. So you can see, and there's a little bit about the pubs and how they may help you with a given task as part of a given step. So That is that. And then here we see the task outcomes table. So these have been included now for every step. It has one of these task outcome tables at the beginning. And so it goes over what the expected outcomes are. And so when we see the task structure, we'll see that we also have an expected output, but output and outcome is different. Outcome is more high level. What do we expect from this task? And when we have completed all the tasks in the step, what are our outcomes that we expect? And in that, we can see that it specifies where we are in the cybersecurity framework. So if you've done the control implementation, control specified, one of the outcomes is controls specified in security and privacy plans are implemented, and that corresponds to the stated privacy framework.
Cybersecurity framework.
I'm sorry, cybersecurity framework.
Privacy framework coming.
Yes, yeah. Framework, there's too many frameworks. So, but anyway, we just hope that this will be helpful so everyone stays on the same sheet of music. What are we trying to accomplish here? What are our outcomes? That's what these tables are intended to convey. And then here we have the parts of our task structure. Every task within every step has these parts. And so, of course, the task section, there it is. The task section, it tells you what is the task, it describes what the task actually is. And then we added these two parts new in Rev 2, and these are the potential inputs and expected outputs. So what do we mean when we say potential? We mean you may not need to have every single thing that's in that list. So, and what may that depend on? Risk management. Do we have toothbrushes? Do we have diamonds? You know, if we have toothbrushes, we may not have everything on the list, or we may not need to look at everything on the list. Or the organization might not even have those things. And then, whereas if we have diamonds, maybe we have more comprehensive documentation along with that. So it depends on the task and the step that we're in, but in general, with potential, we mean this is a list to help you understand what you might need to complete this task. It's not, you must have every single one of these things. So no one should get wound up around the axle over that, but they should look at those potential inputs and, and try to have what they have so that the task can be completed with as much information as possible. And then we have the expected output. So when we're finished, we've looked at our potential outputs, we've done the task, and now what do we expect to see at the end of that task completion? And then we have the responsibility section, the primary responsibility. This is who's responsible for making sure or ensuring the task is completed. That responsible party may not be the one who actually does the work of the task, but the person is responsible for ensuring that the task is completed. So that's what we mean in the primary responsibility section. And then some more things in the task structure. We have then the supporting roles section. So the supporting roles are roles that the primary roles may need to ask for advice. They may need their input. The supporting roles may be the ones who are actually doing the work of the task, but they're still supporting the whoever the primary responsibility role is in getting that task completed. As we've had always in the past, we have the SDLC phase section, and this tells you if you're doing this task, here's where you should probably be in the SDLC. And not surprisingly, since we have to get all the way to the very last step until we're operational and we're in monitoring, most of the tasks take place during the initiation and development phases. But you'll see that. And that's, of course, if you're going through it for the first time. If you have an existing system, then it gets a little more squishy what SDLC phase you might be in. But we cover that as well in 37 Rev 2. And we see there that the SDLC phase section is not in the prepare step because we're not at the system level yet. So we're not in the organizational prepare step. You won't see that section there. Of course, we always have a discussion section. We used to call it the supplemental guidance. Now it's called discussion, and this is where we have some more information to help you complete the task. And then finally, the references section, and that's where you'll see those pubs that were around the wheel and also some additional pubs that indicates that if you're trying to complete this task, here's some information and guidance that might help you complete the task. And here we see an example of what the tasks look like with all of those inputs and sections that we just discussed. And this is where Vicki's going to take
All
over.
right, so now we officially begin the deep dive into the steps of the RMF. As Kelly mentioned earlier, the prepare step is newly added into RMF 2.0. So the addition of the prepare step is one of the key changes to the RMF. This was incorporated to help achieve a more effective, efficient, and cost-effective security and privacy risk management processes. So it's really important to emphasize, while this step is new, the guidance contained in this step is not new. Much of it already existed in other NIST publications, such as NIST SP 839, Managing Information Security Risk at the Organization, Mission, and Information System Level View, SP 816, other OMB policies, 160, I'm sorry, other OMB policies, and it formalizes a lot of tasks that organizations should have been doing at both organization and mission business level to really enable those at the system level to understand and manage the risks to those systems. So while it's new, you should have kind of been doing it already. So the primary objective of the prepare step is really to institutionalize both that organization level and system level preparation. By doing so, we're facilitating better communication between the senior leaders and executives at the C-suite level, the organization level of the pyramid, tying it to the mission business processes, and ultimately, again, enabling the folks at the system level to understand risk and manage it better for their system. This facilitates, the prepare step also is intended to facilitate organization-wide identification and of common controls and tailored control baselines. Again, ultimately, by this work being done at the organization level, so it can be shared across the organization, it's less onerous on the system level. For the system owners to implement. And ultimately, by sharing these resources could lead to more cost-effective and efficient system development and asset protection. We ultimately want to encourage reducing the complexity of the IT and OT infrastructure by promoting some of these enterprise architecture concepts and models to help consolidate and optimize and standardize our systems, applications, and services across the organization. We really want to try to reduce the complexity of systems by eliminating kind of unnecessary functions and security and privacy capabilities that don't really address specific security and privacy risks. And ultimately, we're trying to support the identification, prioritization, and the focus of our organization's very limited resources on those high-value assets, the crown jewels of your organization that really require the increased levels of protection, and taking measures that are commensurate with risk. As Kelly was saying, you want to protect those diamonds more than you want to protect those toothbrushes, right? So by achieving these objectives, we're hoping that through the prepare step, organizations can help simplify their execution of the RMF and even kind of leverage these new tasks to employ some innovative approaches to managing risk and ultimately increase the level of automation where feasible to carry out specific tasks, because that's just the direction we're all moving in. So let's talk about these tasks. So at the prepare step, there's two sections, the organization and mission business process levels, and then the system level. We'll start at the organization and mission business process. The first one is to identify the risk management roles. So obviously organizations have different missions, functions, structures, so there might be a difference in the naming conventions for the risk management roles like we mentioned earlier. But ultimately, no matter what they're called, there are certain key functionalities that need to be accomplished, and people need to fill those roles. So by identifying those at the organization level, you kind of set who's responsible for what at the very top. For task 2, the risk management strategy. This is something that was really emphasized in Special Publication 839, so this is not a new requirement. But this is something that was often really overlooked at the system level. In order for a system to understand the system owner to understand what they need to protect. They really need to understand the risk management strategy of the organization and the risk tolerance defined by the organization. I like to say that's above the system owner's pay grade to decide what the risk tolerance of the organization is. So ultimately, this risk management strategy guides and informs risk-based decisions, including how security and privacy risk is framed, assessed, responded to, and monitored. The risk management strategy makes explicit the threats, any assumptions or constraints, priorities, trade-offs, and risk tolerance for making these both the investment and the operational decisions. So like I said, way above the pay grade of this poor system owner, right? The strategy often will include strategic level decisions and considerations for how the senior leadership manages security and privacy risks to the organizational operations and assets. Like I mentioned before, the risk management strategy does include an expression of risk tolerance, acceptable risk assessment methodologies, and risk response strategies. Again, laying that groundwork for risk management at the system. Now that we have a risk management strategy in place and identified, we look to risk assessment at the organizational level. So risk assessment at the organizational level leverages the aggregated information from system-level risk assessment results, continuous monitoring, and any strategic risk decisions that might be relevant to that organization. At the organizational level, the totality of this risk from the operation and use of the systems is considered, including other internal and externally owned systems. So that's P3. And again, for each of these tasks, we point to the relevant source documentation or publication. So for both P2 and P3, you can read a lot more about both of those in SP 839 and 830. All right, task 4. This is where we jump into some of the new optional tasks that were created in Rev 2 to help provide that flexibility for organizations that wanted additional flexibility beyond the baseline control selection approach. So task P4 discusses organizationally tailored control baselines and cybersecurity framework profiles, really tying the RMF and CSF together. So in order to address the organizational mission or business needs for specialized sets of controls to reduce risk, we introduced the concept of the organizationally tailored control baseline, and that can be developed at the organization level for use across the organization. Organizationally tailored baselines, say that 3 times fast, and overlays complement the existing NIST control baselines that are referenced in the forthcoming special publication 853B, B for baselines, that will be released in parallel with Rev 5 of 853. But Ron will talk about that more, I'm sure, later. So these organizationally tailored baselines will complement the NIST control baselines. So this gives an organization the opportunity to add or eliminate controls to accommodate whatever organizational requirements you might have specific to your organization, environment of operation, et cetera, while continuing to protect the information commensurate with risk. This is the key thing that we always go back to. It's not just about picking some controls and doing them. It's identifying and picking those controls to address specific risks, bringing the risk to the system and the organization down to an acceptable level within your risk tolerance per your risk management strategy. An organizationally tailored baseline can provide a fully specified set of controls, control enhancements, and even additional supplemental guidance above and beyond what NIST provides from the established control baselines. Organizations can use these tailored control baselines if there's a divergence from the specific assumptions that are used to create the NIST control baselines. So the examples of this would include maybe situations where an organization has a specific security or privacy risk, has a very specific mission or business need, or has plans to operate in environments that are not really addressed in the initial baselines. Organizations can also use tailored baselines and controls to customize these control baselines, but describing the control applicability, and providing interpretations for specific technologies, types of missions or business functions, different OSs, different environments of operation. So this is really where the organization can take the resources that NIST has provided and really tailor them for their own specific needs. Again, this is an optional task, but we really wanted to emphasize this. Although it was always implied in Rev 1 of 37, I think calling this out and saying, hey, organization, the world is your oyster. From there, P5 is identifying common controls. Again, the whole intent of these prepare step and these tasks at the organization level is for that base to be set by the organization to enable the system level and the system owners to have an easier time doing their job and giving them more resources. So again, I think common controls identification was also something that was implicit or implied in the previous version of the RMF, but now we're really calling it out front and center, so no excuses this time. So common controls are those controls that are available to be inherited by one or more systems. Common controls can include controls from any control family. They can include physical and environmental, system boundary and monitoring, policies and procedures, acquisition. Almost any control could be a common control. Organizations would identify and select sets of common controls and allocate these controls to different organizational entities designated as common control providers, and we'll definitely be talking about those a little bit later. Common controls are then, once they're available, are communicated to the system owners, so they're aware of what controls they can leverage, which means they can say, hey, Kelly's the common control provider. I don't have to implement these controls because I'm relying on Kelly.
Shouldn't be there guessing.
Yeah, it's not guesswork. I'm like, I think Kelly's providing access control, but I'm not sure. Making this available to the system owners, again, enables them to do their job better and make their lives easier, because doing it once for the organization and making it available to your dozens of system owners is better than system owners individually having to do it themselves. Impact level prioritization, task P6. This is also a new task and also optional. One thing to note about this task is this task is really only carried out after the organizational systems have been categorized. So we'll talk about that later. But really this task requires that organizations first apply the high watermark concept to each of their systems, categorized in accordance with FIPS 199 and 200. But then, ultimately you're going to end up with a bunch of high systems, probably even more moderate systems, and maybe even more low impact systems, I don't know. But how do you allocate resources? Obviously you want to allocate the most resources to your high impact systems. Fine, we're done with those. But now I have a whole bunch of moderate impact systems. How do I pick my favorite moderate system? It's like picking your favorite child, right? It's the one that causes you the least grief. But ultimately, how do you allocate the very limited resources that we have to all of those moderate and low impact systems? This impact level prioritization lets you have a moderate high, a moderate moderate, a moderate low. So really you get an additional level of granularity that helps you better allocate resources, understand what the needs are for that system and the risks are for that system. Again, an optional task, but hopefully that was an activity that was happening anyways within organizations, but by making it its own task, we're really emphasizing, the RMF is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It needs to be tailored for your organization. Task P7 is the continuous monitoring strategy at the organization level. So an important aspect of risk management is the ability to monitor the security and privacy posture across the organization and the effectiveness of the controls implemented within or inherited by systems on an ongoing basis. An effective organization-wide continuous monitoring strategy is really essential to the efficiency and the cost-effectiveness in order to carry out this monitoring. Implementation of this comprehensive continuous monitoring program helps the organization understand the security and privacy posture of their systems at any time and facilitates ongoing authorization after the initial system or common control authorizations. And Kelly will talk about how we've incorporated ongoing authorization guidance into Rev 2 a little bit later. So essentially, the organizational continuous monitoring strategy addresses all the monitoring requirements at the organization, mission, business process, and the system levels. The strategy identifies minimum monitoring frequency for the implemented controls, defines the ongoing control assessment approach. This way it's consistent across all of the systems, and the system owners can just point to it, be like, I'm following the organizational strategy. Let's see, and the continuous monitoring strategy may also define even more granular things like the security and privacy reporting requirements, but that's really up to the organization. All right, we have addressed preparing at the organization and mission business level. Let's get ready to dive into the system level. So now, as we consider the system, we consider the mission and business focus of said system. So organizational missions and business functions will obviously influence the design and development of the processes to carry out the functions and ultimately the system. So the prioritization of these missions and business functions drive both the investment strategies, funding decisions, resource prioritization, and risk decisions that ultimately impact how we design, develop, and acquire that system. P9, system stakeholders. This is bringing in concepts from the System Security Engineering publication, addressing the systems that system stakeholders. So those are the individuals, organizations, or representatives that have an interest in the system throughout the SDLC for design, development, implementation, delivery, operation, and sustainment. So it's really important to identify who those stakeholders in this new system are going to be and get that communication flow started right away. P10 is identifying the assets that are going to be part of this system. So assets can be both the tangible and intangible items that are of value to the achievement of said mission or business objectives. So tangible assets might include the physical and environmental elements, human elements, hardware, and the intangible assets are obviously the non-physical things in nature, and it might include the mission and business processes, functions, digital information and data, software services. And so knowing what those are before you design your system is really critical. As Kelly was discussing earlier, the authorization boundary is defined here in the prepare system level. So the authorization boundary of the system establishes the scope of protection for the system. Authorization boundaries are determined by the authorizing official with input from the system owner based on the mission, management, or budgetary responsibilities. It's really worthwhile to mention here that in the previous revision of 37, the terms system boundary and authorization boundary were used interchangeably, which actually caused a lot of confusion. So in revision 2, we're just using the term authorization boundary for that now. All right, we're still preparing at the system level. You're almost done with me, I promise. P12, information types. So as Kelly alluded to earlier, it's really important to identify the types of information that are needed for the system to support the missions, business functions, and the mission business processes. And this is a precondition for security categorization. You can't categorize your system and the information on it if you don't know what it is. NIST Special Publication 860 and the NARA CUI Registry are great resources there and provide kind of a starting point for how you would identify and begin to categorize those information types. Naomi is going to talk a little bit about the information life cycle.
Yeah, I think the reason I'm going to talk about it is because we think that this is particularly important when talking about PII and privacy. And as I mentioned earlier, right, when we talk about processing sort of from this authorized processing standpoint, we're very concerned about this information lifecycle. So collection through disposal of information, really understanding what's going on is going to play into your risk assessment. And so for privacy, that it's not just, sort of what data, but also, what are the roles in it? Is this information coming from external parties, going to external parties? And, I'll just say a quick word on authorization boundary in this context, which is, from a privacy standpoint, sometimes what the concerns and where the privacy risks may be arising may be sort of different from what security traditionally considers the authorization boundary. And so, you're going to hear over and over again in this, collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. We do think that this is an important point to have collaboration and discussion between privacy and security about, what's happening with information, where are the risks arising, and, what impact might that have on the authorization boundary.
All right. So looking back to P14, looking at the risk assessment at the system level. So this is assessing the security risk at the system level, which includes identification of threat sources, threat events, affected assets, how those assets are vulnerable to threats, the likelihood that the asset vulnerability will be exploited by a threat, and the impact or consequence of loss of those assets. NIST Special Publication 830, which we'll not go into in depth here today, provides a soup to nuts methodology for one way of conducting a risk assessment at the system level. And when we mentioned earlier, when you aggregate these system level risk assessments, that's how you do your organization-wide risk assessment. Still not done. P15. Then we define the privacy risk assessment.
Yeah, let me just say a quick word on that because, I talked earlier sort of about some background and how we've provided in NIST IR 8062 a concept of a privacy risk model that can really help organizations think through where are privacy risks coming when we're talking about sort of this authorized processing. So that can be a resource for organizations as they're doing those kinds of assessments, really thinking about the impact on individuals. And, we also, NIST has developed a privacy risk assessment methodology, which is essentially a tool, a set of worksheets that actually applies the risk model and helps organizations, walk through this process, sort of mirroring a lot of the RMF steps from some of these prepare and mission business objectives all the way through to selecting controls. So we think that can be a good companion resource. And it's available on the Privacy Engineering Program website for NIST.
Shameless plug, it's okay. Task 15 ties back to the systems engineering, where we're defining the security and privacy requirements for the system and an environment of operation. So the security and privacy requirements are formal, more granular expressions of the protection needs, which are protection capabilities needed for the system to bring security and privacy risks to an acceptable level across all the SDLC phases. So the security and privacy requirements can be obtained from many sources, including laws, executive orders, directives, regulations, policy standards, mission business needs, or even just risk assessments. So the definition of the security and privacy requirements are really an important part of the formal expression of the required characteristics of the system. All right, you're almost done. I promise you're almost done with me. Task P16 is the enterprise architecture. That's a management practice that's used to maximize the effectiveness of the mission and business processes and the information resources to achieve mission and business success. The enterprise architecture can provide kind of greater understanding of the information and operational technologies included in the initial design and development of systems, and really is kind of a prerequisite to achieving the resilience and survivability of those systems in our ever-increasing environment of sophisticated threats. This enterprise architecture provides the opportunities for organizations to consolidate, standardize, and optimize information and technology assets. So by developing an effective and implementing your architecture, you'll get systems that are more transparent and are easier to understand and protect, and you understand where they are, who's responsible for what. Now that we've identified what the requirements are, we understand the architecture of our enterprise, now we can allocate those requirements through P17 to security and privacy requirements are allocated and will ultimately guide the control selection and implementation for the organization, system, elements, or the environment of operation. So the requirements allocation identifies where the controls will be implemented in a later step. And finally, this next step, P18 system registration, used to be part of the categorize step, but we decided to move it up to the prepare step because this really kicks off the formalization of, hey guys, I need to build a system. Let me notify my senior management. I need money, I need resources. And it provides a way for the organization to kind of keep track of what's in the hopper for them. All right, you are done with prepare. Are you all prepared?
So I'm going to talk now about the same old steps that we always have had in the RMF, the original 6 steps. So beginning with categorization. So we went through the prep step, and now we know what our authorization boundaries are, we have our risk assessment results. We have allocated our requirements. We as system owners can look at our common control identifications provided by our organization. And so all of these things are now available to us as the system owner as we start to go through the remaining 6 steps and the associated tasks. So the categorize step, this is where we figure out, we already figured out what our information types are. Now we categorize them. What is the impact of loss with respect to confidentiality, integrity, and availability? But anyway, the overall step purpose, as we can see there, is making sure that organizational risk management processes and tasks are informed by knowing what the adverse impact of loss is. So that's sort of what I already said. And now we see the tasks there. We do our system description, so we lay it out, what the description of our system is. Maybe we have some system diagrams, and that helps us understand our information flow and where our information types are going. And then knowing that, we can actually categorize them. What is the impact of loss with respect to all 3 security objectives? So what is the impact of loss of confidentiality? What is the impact of loss of integrity? What is the impact of loss of availability? And we roll that up into that high water mark for our final system security categorization. So nothing new there at all. Security categorization review and approval. This is, again, formalizing something that really should have already been happening. We were just sort of assuming that once the categorization was done, that the authorizing official would be in on that discussion and decision, what it was. But maybe that wasn't happening, so we wanted to make sure that it did. So we added this task, make sure that the authorizing official is on board with what the categorization decision is. And what does that tell us? That tells us, do we have diamonds or toothbrushes, you know? So now we need that information before we can move forward.
And I'll just say a quick word because I think sometimes there's some confusion about how privacy fits into this step, this task. And so I think, you know, the key words here was, right, the loss or the impact of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And if you think back to that Venn diagram we showed early on, really, that's really talking about that overlap, right, where the information that would be impacted is PII. And so absolutely, privacy has a role in categorization when systems are processing PII and having, you know, trying to determine, you know, what the impact of loss of PII would be, you know, and how that should impact the impact level. But you know, I want to make the very important point that earlier step in prepare of doing that privacy risk assessment, right, really goes to the authorized side. So categorization is great for sort of unauthorized access to PII and unauthorized impacts. But we still have to bring in the risk assessment on the authorized side because, and I know we're going to get into that, so I don't want to, you know, preview too much, but what's the point of categorization, right? This is not a checklist exercise. The point of categorization is to help you select security controls, the right ones. And so those controls will certainly help if you're talking about, you know, protecting the security of PII. But they don't go all the way to the full scope of privacy risk. And so there may be other controls that address that other aspect, that authorized processing aspect of privacy risk. And that's why you need also a privacy risk assessment to help you when you get to the control selection stage to think about what other controls you might need. And so, for example, like just think about privacy notices, right? If you select that control against some sort of categorization impact, what exactly is that going to do to help you protect from unauthorized access to PII? It's not, but it is an important control when you're thinking about authorized privacy risks. So you have to think about everything in its totality.
Going back and forth. Okay, so select step. So after we've categorized and we understand what the impact of loss of our information is, now we can go to the select step and make sure we get the right set of controls implemented. So the select step purpose, selecting, tailoring, and documenting the controls that we need to protect our systems and reduce risk, basically. The tasks, we see here the control selection. So this is when we're going through and we're actually using the information we have from our risk assessment activities, from our categorization activities, and figuring out what controls do we need to implement. And then we added this task for tailoring. So tailoring previously was sort of wrapped up in the control selection process. We mentioned it in the task discussion about tailoring. We discussed tailoring later in 37 and in 53, but organizations in some cases were maybe afraid to tailor, or they'd been told by their authorizing official, no, we have to use the baseline. And so, but we need to manage risk, and we need to make sure that we manage it appropriately. And so we go through and we have a set process for how we can do our tailoring and make the controls that we selected fit perfectly with our system to protect it. And so we have numerous ways of doing tailoring. The tailoring process is now described in 853B, right?
Yes.
And so we'll see the whole discussion of that. So I'm not going to go into how we tailor, but just know that control tailoring is an integral step, an important actual task within the select step. So it's not something that should be skipped over. And in fact, FIPS 200 actually tells us that we should tailor our baselines. So then we have control allocation. So we had requirements allocation in the prepare step. Now we're going to actually allocate controls. So part of that control allocation is understanding what our common controls are and allocating controls that we need to those common control providers. And so that we know the system owner doesn't have to do it. And also it's allocating controls to specific components within the system. So we may have a log management server that's taking care of all our audit or our AU controls. And so we don't implement the controls on every component within the system in some cases. So this is where we take a look at that and see where we can find some savings of resources and make sure that we have the right controls on the right components within the system. And so some more parts, tasks in the select step, we have documenting the plan control implementation. So we went through, we selected controls, we tailored our baselines, we allocated controls to components, and now we need to document what we did. So right now we're still planning. This is the first time we're going through the RMF, so this is what we plan to do. We plan to implement these controls in this way, and we tailored them in this way. And part of tailoring is related to implementation with respect to the assignment statements and selection statements. So all of that goes to our planned control implementations and documenting them in our security plans. So that's an added step, a new step in the select step. Then we have here control monitoring strategy at the system level. So we're still quite early in the process. We're in the select step, and we don't start monitoring all the way till the very last step, but it's very important that we understand before we start trying to implement our controls what we're going to do for our continuous monitoring at the system level. So we have the new step in the in the organizational prepare step, where the organization does an organization-wide continuous monitoring strategy. So now the system owner and authorizing official take that organization-wide strategy and where do we need to fill in the blanks at our system level, or where does the organization-wide continuous monitoring strategy not work for us because we need more monitoring or additional monitoring tasks. So we fill that in at the system level here during the select step, because once we start implementing, we need to be planning for how we're going to do our continuous monitoring. So we don't save that continuous monitoring strategy till the continuous monitoring step. We do it quite early in the process here in the select step. And finally, we have secure plan review and approval. So this is not new. We did always have a formalized step where the authorizing official approves what we've said we're going to do. These are the controls we're going to put in place. Here's the parameters. We've tailored them. We have our common controls. We know all of these things. Is this sufficient to protect the system? Mr. or Ms. authorizing official, and then that person reviews and hopefully approves the plan. And sorry.
And I'll just sort of overlay a quick word on sort of the privacy and security collaboration, again, on sort of these plans. And, we don't have a view, and so you will see reflected in the discussion that there's not a review of whether you need to have an integrated plan or separate plans between privacy and security. Either one could work for your organization, but recognize that because of that sort of data security overlap, and in terms of your selection of controls, that we certainly encourage collaboration between the two programs to make sure that you're selecting controls appropriately and meet the needs of both programs.
Okay. So, whoops, I think I went. So now we've got our controls selected, and we need to start actually implementing them or making sure they've already been implemented as part of the system development lifecycle. We're going to implement them as close to how we've already specified in our security plan as we can. And our specific tasks for that are do that implementation, and then when we find that there were a few things that didn't work out when we tried to implement, we had to change the way we were implementing, then we update our security plan with whatever the final implemented state of the control details are. So nothing new there. And we move on now to the assess step. And in the assess step, we try to determine if those controls that we selected and implemented are functioning as we expected and as we want them to and as they need to protect the system and the information. So we have, as part of the assess controls tasks, we have select your assessors. So it's important. We added that as a new task. Again, it seems obvious that the organization or the system owner, would select assessors, but we wanted to formalize this, and we wanted to make it clear that those assessors need to be selected and they need to have the appropriate skill sets for the system in question. So, easy example, if you've got a system with a bunch of databases and database management system, you need to make sure that there's someone who's technically well-versed in databases on your assessment team. So, and that all the assessors have the appropriate skills, and it also discusses in the assessor selection about assessor independence. And if it's a moderate or high impact system, then those assessors do need to be independent of the system staff. Sorry.
According to A130, that's not necessarily a requirement for privacy, but we do think that you should always be thinking from a risk management standpoint about, the benefits of independence and whether that makes sense, regardless of whatever the requirements may limit you.
Right, so once your assessors are selected and you know who they're going to be, they need to come in and they do the assessment plan. So they're the primary, the assessment team is the primary responsible party or role in developing the assessment plan. And the assessment plan goes through and looks at every control, every component, what components are going to be assessed as part of a given control, what methods and what test methods are you going to use, what objects are you going to look at as part of the method. So all of this is identified in advance in the assessment plan before the assessment even begins. We all know exactly what is going to happen and what objects are going to be looked at. And then we actually do the assessment, or the assessors do anyway. And then once they have completed their assessment, there needs to be a report. And so the assessors complete the assessment report and pass that on up to the authorizing official. There's probably going to be some remediation actions that can be taken quite quickly. So whenever you get an assessment report, and let me take the opportunity right now to say that when you have assessors coming in, and you should not be afraid or try to hide things from them. They are helping you figure out where you might have vulnerabilities in your system, where controls might not be effective, so that the bad guys don't get the information. So the assessors are the good guys, and they should be treated as such, and you should welcome them with open arms. And seriously, all joking aside, you really should, because they're there to help you, and they're there to help you find problems in your system, vulnerabilities in your system before attackers do. So keep that in mind with respect to assessments. But anyway, when you get the report and the assessors are finished, there might be a few bits of low-hanging fruit that you can hurry up and repair and fix or remediate before you move on to the plan of action and milestones and the final report. So that's step A5, is doing those remediation actions, and then the plan of action and milestones is developed, what were the findings, and then that is all passed on to the authorizing official.
And I'll just say a quick word on privacy, because you'll note that Special Publication 853A, the assessment procedures, is an important supporting document for this step. And, it is our intent to update that for privacy controls and assessment procedures. In fact, we had a workshop last year to begin, thinking through that process. And very interesting themes that came out. So certainly aware that people need more training and more guidance in this, and we certainly intend to try to supply that.
And just adding really fast there, that the plan of action milestones was another thing that was moved. That was in the authorized step, and now it's moved to assess. So no biggie.
All right, so now we're finally ready to authorize. I think the main takeaway of authorization is authorizing the system to operate is about senior management taking responsibility for risk acceptance. Ultimately, the authorizing official does not have to authorize the system. Authorization denial is definitely one of the options if the risk is unacceptable. And that's just something I want to emphasize. So the whole point of the authorize is to provide that senior level accountability, to make sure that a senior management official determines that the security and privacy risk is acceptable and within the risk tolerance defined in the risk management strategy. So you'll see a few things, a few tasks that are new, not necessarily 100% new, but previously implied and now specifically called out. So that's what I mean by new. There are no specific supporting publications on Authorize, but the tasks and the discussion provide a lot of guidance on the process. And we do also have an in-depth appendix discussing different kinds of authorization decisions and authorizations that we'll cover towards the end of the presentation. So first is the authorization package. So the authorization package includes the security and privacy plans, the security and privacy assessment reports, the plans of action and milestones, and even an executive summary. Additional information can be included in the authorization package at the request of the authorizing official. I'm going to steal Naomi's thunder a little here and say the senior agency official for privacy also reviews the authorization package for systems that process PII to ensure that there's compliance with the applicable privacy requirements and to manage the privacy risks before the authorizing official makes that risk determination. So they are ultimately a very critical part of that step, even though they're not the final stamp. I'd like to really highlight one thing that I've seen in a lot of questions that we get asked when we do presentations and emails, is the very common misnomer that the authorization package is a huge binder of paper. Please don't print out the paper, save a tree. The authorization package can be provided to the authorizing official in a hard copy if they wish, or electronically, or maybe even generated using an automated security and privacy management and reporting tool. So again, it's not a paperwork exercise. This is about understanding the risks to your systems, what the countermeasures you have in place to mitigate against those risks, and to determine if there's any residual risks left over after you've done all those countermeasures. And are those residual risks okay? By no means is this supposed to be drowning in paperwork, but this is providing the right level of information so that your senior management official, your authorizing official, can make an informed decision, because ultimately they're the one that signs on that dotted line and potentially gets fired when things go wrong, right? Another common misnomer that I hear a lot is the concept of the 3-year authorization cycle. This went away a long time ago. The authorization documents are now updated at an organization-defined frequency using either automated or manual processes in accordance with the risk management objectives of the organization. So 3 years might only be 3 years if your organization dictates. Back to the tasks at hand. R2, risk analysis and determination. This has been revised to really clarify that before the authorizing official makes a decision, they do their due diligence. They review the information that they're given. They make informed decisions and follow up the relevant stakeholders if they need more information. So they think about their decision before they make it. Risk response, R3. This is a new task, but this is something that was also just previously implied. So after the risk is analyzed and determined, organizations can choose to respond to risk in a variety of ways, including accepting risk or mitigating the risk. Using the risk assessment results and the risk assessment techniques that are referenced in Special Publication 830, they can be helped to determine the preferred course of action for said risk response. In the event that controls need to be reassessed, control reassessments determine the extent of which remediated controls are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome with respect to meeting those security and privacy requirements for the system. So authorization decision. Again, to highlight this again, after the authorizing official has thought about what they want to do, done the due diligence, reviewed the information available to them, they ultimately make the authorization decision. We'll cover this in more detail later, but there's options for what their decision can be. It can be the authorization to operate. It could be a common control authorization, which is an authorization to operate for common controls. The authorization to use, which is a rebranded form of the leveraged authorization in 837 Rev 1. Now we have a cute acronym, the ATU. And then we have, obviously, the denial of authorization. But again, it's important to note that the authorization decision can result in a denial of authorization when the risk is unacceptable. You don't have to say yes. In that event, the authorization decision also would convey if the system is authorized to operate or the common controls are authorized. The authorization decision conveys the terms and conditions for the authorization to operate, the authorization termination date or any time-driven authorization frequencies. Input from the senior accountable official for risk management or the risk executive function can be part of the authorization decision, and obviously for common control authorizations, they would also include the system impact level that the common controls would support. I'd also just like to call out that we do also get a good number of customer inquiries about the interim authorization to operate, the IATO, and the interim authorization to test. NIST does not recognize the IATO, nor does OMB. And in those circumstances where you do want to grant an authorization for a short period of time, an authorizing official may elect to grant an authorization with additional terms or conditions restricting the authorization, and also for a shorter with a shorter authorization date, 30, 60, 90 days, what have you. R5, authorization reporting. This is also a new task that was just previously implied. Once you decide whether you're going to authorize the system, you report it to the appropriate or please tell someone. See something, say something. So you report the authorization decision, so people know that the system is good to go. So at this point, I'm going to let Kelly talk about monitoring because continuous monitoring is her jam.
Thank you very much. So we'll roll through this pretty quickly. There's not too much new here, and we're starting to run low on time, so we don't need to belabor points that have already been made in the past. But anyway, the purpose of the monitor step is to, maintain ongoing situational awareness. So once we're authorized to operate, now we need to check and continually make sure that our controls remain effective. So we don't wait 3 years to check again.
Your mic is not on.
My mic was not on, so I said a bunch of really interesting things there.
She did.
No, seriously, the monitor step is all about making sure that that as we move forward in time, that our controls are still effective. So we don't wait 3 years to check again. We're looking at them on an ongoing basis to make sure, as we monitor, that the controls are operating as intended. And note there that we incorporate all monitoring, risk monitoring, configuration management monitoring, control effectiveness monitoring. It should be part of one big monitoring program. Our steps remain the same, looking at the changes to our systems and environment as we monitor, doing ongoing assessments of control effectiveness as we monitor, ongoing risk responses. So when we had that step in the authorize, we added, was it in authorize or, yeah, where we added risk response?
Yes, authorize.
So as we continue to go through, as we monitor, we're going to come up, the same things are going to happen. Problems are going to be discovered. Do we mitigate? Do we accept? We have ongoing risk response as part of our monitoring task. Authorization package updates. So anytime anything like that happens, if we decide to mitigate, we make a change, we add a control, we update our documents. And then we have security and privacy reporting. So similar to the authorized step, we're continually reporting the status of our monitoring and what we found. And so the authorizing official or the risk executive function or incident responders, whoever needs to, should be able to pull reports that come from the data collected by our continuous monitoring. And then we have ongoing authorization. So this is something that once the system has been authorized the first time, we can move, if your continuous monitoring program is robust, you can move into ongoing authorization. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then finally, let's not forget, when we're all finished with the system, we don't need it anymore, it's being replaced, we have system disposal, and we have some things we need to make sure we take care of from a security and privacy perspective there. So we have our supporting appendices here. Was I supposed to be doing these?
Yes.
Okay. And we see what they all are, pretty standard stuff, that most of which we've already talked about. System and common control authorizations is green for some reason.
So of all the appendices here, the ones that we'll cover during this talk are really focused on the control authorization. We'll be talking about the different kinds of authorizations.
Okay, and here we go. Authorization types. So we have the initial authorization that we do the very first time a system is being authorized. Either it's a brand new system or it somehow had gotten overlooked and we're authorizing it for the very first time. That's the initial authorization. Actually, I have slides on all of these, so let's move on. So here we see again, like I was already saying, the initial startup, the very first time we do this. It's a full zero-based review of the system or of the common controls. So then we have ongoing authorization. Oh wait, let's see what else we have here. System level, right, and common control. So those are two separate things. So we look at the system as part of our initial authorization, or we look at common controls as part of our initial authorization. So not at the same time, usually. All right, Now, ongoing authorization. So we had done a white paper on ongoing authorization back in 2014, and that had been posted for all these years, and now it's everything in that white paper has been incorporated into 37 Rev 2. And so we have a section on ongoing authorization in 37 Rev 2, and ongoing authorization is defined as the subsequent or follow-on risk determinations and risk acceptance decisions as we move forward in time. And they occur at agreed upon and documented intervals, and they can also be time or event driven. So the organization decides how often they want the authorizing official to take a look at the output of our continuous monitoring program and what the control effectiveness is looking like, and how often do they need to do that, and what might it be based on. Risk management, are we going to look at it every day or every week, even if it's a low impact system? I hope not. You know, that's probably not necessary. So, but if it's a high impact system, then maybe we are. And so part of our agreed upon times consider our toothbrushes and diamonds or our risk management needs. Ongoing authorization, and this is very important, dependent on a robust and mature continuous monitoring program. What do we mean by that? We mean that the continuous monitoring program is looking at all controls. That doesn't mean it's automated, that the monitoring of a given control is automated, but that both automated and manual monitoring of all implementing controls is included in our monitoring program. That's when we have a robust and mature continuous monitoring program. So a little bit more, that's basically what I just said, the two specific conditions that for ongoing authorization, we've done our initial zero-based review, and we have our robust continuous monitoring program in place. We have security-related information from monitoring, right, so we need that monitoring program to be in place so that we can get the information we need to give to the authorizing official, hopefully via a SIM-style automated report, and then security-related information from manual, right. So we always include, we're never going to be able to automate the monitoring of all controls, so there's always going to be some manual input to our continuous monitoring program. So reauthorization is something that occurs outside of ongoing authorization, so it's in addition to. It usually, if you're in ongoing authorization, reauthorization usually means something happened that threw you out of that cycle of ongoing authorization. Maybe an event occurred, maybe you're having problems with your continuous monitoring program, you know, who knows, but, or usually it's as a result of some event-driven situation that has happened, and so then the authorizing official asks for a reauthorization. And that can be either a full zero-based review again, like the initial, or it can be focused on something in particular, a section of the system, a new thing that's being added, something like that. And here we have, as Vicki mentioned, our 4 types of authorization decisions. The good old authorization to operate, like we've always had. The common control authorization, which is just like the authorization to operate except applied to common controls. And those, remember, are known to us because during our organizational prepare step, our organization has gone through and given us a list of what the common controls are. And then our authorization to use, as Vicki mentioned, is a revamped leveraged authorization, and it's commonly applied to cloud-based systems, or even more specifically FedRAMP, where the federal organizations have come in and done, looked at the assessment paperwork, looked at all the authorization package, and decided to go ahead and do a provisional authorization to use. And so then other federal organizations can use that authorization that they've given and say, okay, I'm authorizing our organization to use this existing system and this existing authorization documentation and assessment information. So we don't redo that for every. So, but anytime, it doesn't have to be cloud or FedRAMP, anytime another organization has already done an authorization and all the tasks associated with it, then other federal organizations can leverage that. And then the ever popular denial of authorization, as Vicki mentioned. Seriously, you know, I know that authorizing officials are faced with a lot of pressure to have systems functional and be providing that functionality that they need to complete their missions and business processes. But at the same time, you know, if the risk is too high, then we should deny authorization. And authorizing officials should not be afraid to deny if the risk warrants it. Okay. Was that out of order or something?
They're just more detailed.
Okay, some more details. So, authorization to operate, I think we already know a lot about that. Yeah, we're starting to run short on time. There's nothing new here, so let's move on. Common control authorization, we've talked about. Authorization to use, I've talked about. Denial, don't be afraid to. And then we have some other really quick things that we've included. The type authorization, the facility authorization, they often work together. A type authorization, a good example is if you have an application and it's going to be deployed, maybe on hardware, or maybe just you're going to deploy the application to different environments. You can authorize that application with a specified configuration only one time, and then deploy it to multiple locations. And then with that might come a facility authorization, because as you've deployed it to different locations, it's going to be in different environments of operation, and then you might need that facility authorization, and that generally is common controls. And you can also have traditional or joint, nothing new there. If you do joint, you better make sure that you know who's doing what, and that responsibilities are well known. And that is common control authorization, same thing. It needs the same, you still assess it. The common control authorizing official is at the same level as authorizing officials that authorize for the system level. So there's that. Authorization to use, we've already talked about. I don't know what's happening here, but the
I think we're going, you want to go to conduct.
yeah. Well, the important part I just want to point out again is with authorization to use, it is the ATO has been issued by an authorizing official from another federal entity. So you can't have a contractor saying, well, I've authorized this. No, it has to be another federal entity, because only federal entities can authorize systems to operate. Denial, we've already talked about. I apologize. I was looking at the laptop here and not what was actually here, but we have talked about all of these things. So I'm sorry for that confusion, and here now is our actual contact information.
So if you have follow-up questions after the webcast, please, there are emails for everyone on the FISMA and privacy engineering teams. We do try our very best to be responsive. With that, I do recognize that the original webcast was slated to run till 3 p.m., but our tech team here has graciously allowed us to go over. If you're unable to stay for the Q&A session, the recording will be available within 2 weeks, and we will follow up with any questions we don't get to today via email or Twitter direct message. With that, we're going to extend the Q&A session till about 3:15 to get at least a sampling of the many questions that have been blowing up on my phone over the past hour and a half. With that, I'd like to invite up Dr. Ron Ross and Celia Paulson to join the panel, and I'll be moderating you guys. All right, are you ready for the lightning round of Q&As? Is this on? Can you hear me? All right. All right, so I'm going to get us started with privacy, since Naomi's already seated. Naomi, how does the NIST RMF directly support risk and compliance related to privacy regulations such as GDPR and the CCPA?
So, as part of the requirements definition task, it's expected that you're going to derive your requirements from a variety of sources, one of them being the risk assessment that we've talked about, but also from laws or regulations or policies where you might have specific obligations that you need to comply with. And so you can take all of those components and that is going to feed into your requirements definition, which, as we've shown, sort of then feeds down into your control selection, so that you have this traceability that the controls that you're implementing and assessing in that system are helping you to meet your obligations, whether they come from law or regulation.
Thank you. Next question. Thank you for our panelists, for Q&A panelists, for doing the lightning round version of the answers. So what kind of guidance can you provide on how security and privacy control assessments be coordinated? I do not want my security control assessors assessing privacy controls, since most of them do not have the prerequisite privacy background. This might be a great Kelly and Naomi joint question.
So this is why we did, put in, dual roles for all of these, aspects, control assessors. You'll note that there's control assessors, and we talk about that from both the privacy and security standpoint. This was a topic that came up a lot in our assessment workshop, particularly as people are trying to figure out, well, do I even have assessors that have that skill set that can assess those controls? And we certainly hope through updates to 53A to put out more guidance in that area. But, absolutely, we understand that there can be different skill sets, and you might need assessors who can cover both.
Right, it's really related to what we were saying during the assessment phase when you identify the right assessors. So if your system contains PII, then you certainly need to make sure that part of your assessment team is not just security people, but people who understand the privacy issues, right?
Exactly.
All right, next question. Thank you, guys. Hello. There have been many references to NIST Special Publication 853B. I don't see that document anywhere, or even a draft version. When can we expect to see something on this publication? Ron?
Yes, the 853 Bravo is an artifact that has come out of the 853 Revision 5 update. What we decided to do in the Rev 5 update is to separate the controls, the catalog, from the baselines. Those baselines have been around for a long, long time. They're tied back to FIPS 199, FIPS 200, and those were the basic allocation of controls for low, moderate, and high impact systems. But in Rev 5, as you've seen from the 837, the RMF 2.0 update, we're making these publications suitable for a wider audience, not just the enterprise folks who do risk management, but we're also trying to make it applicable or useful for security engineers and people that build systems and do requirements engineering. And so separating the baselines and all the tailoring guidance into a new publication, that is what is going to emerge as 53 Bravo. So in some sense, we're building a series of publications. Now in that publication, and it will appear, it's already done, that was one of Kelly's last things that she did. It will be hit the streets the same time as the 853 Rev 5 final public draft is released, whenever that date might be. We're still uncertain. That document now, Rev 5, is in final review at OMB. It's the final public draft. And when that date comes, you will see the initial public draft of 853 Bravo. Just one quick note, in that initial draft, there will be 3 federal baselines: low impact, moderate impact, and high impact. We were on a conference call yesterday with our colleagues over at GSA in the FedRAMP program, and some of the future expansions to 53 Bravo may include things like a FedRAMP set of baseline controls for cloud computing, also very important for our customers. So all of those things that would be officially approved either through policy, regulation, or legislation, things that have the throw weight of those things behind them, those are the types of baselines and possibly overlays, like a PKI overlay or something in that nature. Those would be suitable for 53 Bravo.
And we're also looking at privacy baseline that will help organizations select, or federal, sort of a federal one that will help with selection of controls around authorized processing.
In fact, there is the privacy baseline will be in the first iteration of the 53 Bravo, so that's a good point.
I think Ron touched on this earlier, and even though I'm supposed to be asking questions, I'm going to answer my own question a little bit too. One of the efforts to split the baselines apart from the controls was to really keep the control catalog a pure catalog. If you're not using any of the recommended NIST baselines or even any future baselines that we incorporate into 53 Bravo, then 853 itself just becomes that control catalog. Similar to the Sears catalog, you can pick and choose what you want or use your own baseline approach, and you don't have to use 853B. So that kind of gives both federal and non-federal audiences a broader reach into the NIST resources that we have available for you guys.
I just wanted to, one last point on 53 Rev 5. The original catalog of controls had 17 families, and that 17 number didn't come out of it. It came from FIPS 200. We had 17 minimum requirements that appeared in the original FIPS 200. The new 853 Rev 5 is going to have 20 families. And those additional 3 families, in addition to the original 17, the 18th family is the program management family of controls that used to be in its own appendix. Now we have one continuous catalog unified. All the controls are in the same place. And then we have of course, we have one new privacy family. That'll be the 19th family. That was a consolidation of the 8 previous families that were in Rev 4. And so those privacy controls are going to be in a single family plus in the PM family. And then some of the privacy controls now are unified with security controls and doing double duty. We've found great efficiencies in merging some of those capabilities into a single control. And then, of course, I know Celia is here to represent the supply chain. We have a brand new supply chain risk management family. That'll be the 20th family. Again, supply chain is a huge issue today because of our total dependence on technology coming from everywhere around the planet. So we've basically built that new supply chain family. So that's something of a preview of what you can expect when you see Rev 5 come out.
All right, we're getting quite a few questions related to authorization, so let's dive into those. Let's see, the Q&A for the authorization to use, is this what would be accepted for, say, using a cloud service? How does the cloud, leveraging a cloud service link to using the authorization to use? Kelly?
Right, so I apologize because probably my jumbled, hasty conclusion there with the authorization probably confused people. But yes, authorization to use, the cloud-based systems are the poster child for using the authorization to use. So again, if you are using a cloud provider in your federal, you should be going through FedRAMP, is my understanding, and has been for a while. So that's why the FedRAMP provides the Joint Authorization Board. They go through, they look at the assessment details, they look at the security plan and the plan of action milestones, and they determine whether or not they want to give a provisional authorization. So with respect to cloud and FedRAMP, absolutely, that is probably the primary time or use that we'll see for the authorization to use. But again, it doesn't have to be cloud. It can be used in any situation where one federal entity has gone through the RMF process and they're ready to authorize a system to operate, and they do so, then another organization wants to use that same system, either partnering with them or a very similar system, they can leverage that authorization that has already been done. So yes, and services. Yes, it applies to systems, services, and but it's always where some other federal entity has already gone through the authorization process, and now another federal entity can come along and leverage that, and they do an authorization to use versus an authorization to operate, because they're using the existing authorization, and so they authorize their own organization to use that authorization and to use the system or service itself based on the work that had already been done.
Since we're talking about authorization, there's one on ongoing authorization. Can you provide maybe an example of criteria that might throw a system out of ongoing authorization? Just an example, because obviously how your organization determines their criteria is specific to your organization.
I think the prime example would be if there was some sort of an incident occurred, and what happened there. An incident may not be the result of failures in control effectiveness, but it's something where if an incident happened in a system, then, and I'm the authorizing official, I'm going to want to, let's figure out what happened here, and that might entail coming out of ongoing authorization. and doing some sort of reauthorization action and make sure, well, where we are based on the incident information. Or the other example that I always give is maybe there's some problem with your actual continuous monitoring program. And so if you don't have that continuous monitoring information, if that's not working correctly or it's not covering all the controls that you need, then you'd have to come out of ongoing authorization. Can you think of anything else, Ron?
No, I think those cover the big ones, right?
Actually, this one's for you, Ron. Do you have NIST developed recommendations for tailoring the RMF or maybe other publications for secure DevOps?
Secure DevOps and Agile, that's a big topic today because our industry really is working in development cycles that are at internet speed. And so we've always maintained, and this applies also to our 80160, the systems security engineering guidelines, part of the systems engineering process. We're kind of agnostic. You can use traditional development methods, Spiral, Agile, DevOps, all of those things that are really in play today that help our industry bring products, systems, and services to you more quickly. Those can all be used in the risk management framework. What you have to do when you're going through the RMF process, you fulfill the spirit of what the RMF task is asking for. So in the case of DevOps or Agile, you do a lot more initially. You don't have a complete solution or a complete system. Maybe you develop a little bit, you test a little, you roll it out to the customer, and there's this constant feedback cycle, but it's happening fairly quickly. But even though you're in that more rapid cycle, the things that you do in the cycle are still coming from the classic steps in the RMF. In other words, even in Agile or DevOps environments, defining security and privacy requirements is always important. Understanding supply chain considerations, always important. And so those requirements will drive control selection. It may happen more quickly. You may not have everything the first time, but you still use the basic foundation and structure of the RMF. And that's really, at the end of the day, that's the real power of the RMF. It provides discipline and structure to whatever methodology you're using. And that's why we think it works for Agile, DevOps, and all the traditional methods.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the application of RMF processes. Is there a clear method in the RMF's overall processes for applying the RMF to, say, complex non-traditional systems, aircraft, weapons systems, etc.? Maybe IoT?
Right. That's one of the things that we've been trying to stress. I remember back in the early days when Vivek Kundra was just taking over his position at OMB, and he started the Cloud First initiative in cloud computing, and we used to get questions all the time, where are the NIST cloud security controls? And the answer in all of these discussions where you have new technologies like cloud coming in, or now we see IoT or a massive convergence of cyber and physical systems, one thing you have to remember is that all of this stuff, the new technologies, they still go back to computers, firmware, and software. These are still finite state machines, and we still have the same types of software and firmware. Now, in the IoT world, we're seeing that convergence of cyber and physical systems, but this is why 80160 and the systems engineering processes and the life cycle are every bit applicable to IoT systems, IoT-based technologies, as they are to those supercomputers. And so you can use the RMF for non-traditional types of things. So for an aircraft, if you look at an aircraft system, you may have one system maybe dealing with the entertainment for the passengers. The other system, part of that aircraft design, may be dealing with the command and control of the aircraft. And so when you look at the architecture and the design of the totality of the aircraft, you want to ensure that those two systems don't have a lot of interaction, so one side can't influence the other side, primarily the entertainment system, where you could inject vulnerabilities or there could be cyber attacks carried out from one side to the other. That's the power of engineering and architecture, and that applies to everything, whether it's on the point with sensors and IoT, in a pacemaker, in a medical device, in a power plant that powers the city of Chicago, or your laptop or your smartphone. It all gets back to that fundamental thing called the computer, driven by, unfortunately, untrusted software and firmware in many cases.
And I just want to add, whatever you can apply, you can apply. If configuration management if you can't manage the configuration of a sensor or something like that, then it doesn't apply. And so don't get wrapped around the axle of trying to apply controls that don't apply.
That's where tailoring comes in.
Exactly.
This is going to be a softball, actually. Has the NIST RMF team ever done a complete RMF package as a tabletop or practice? Kelly?
So I've done many authorization, to operate through the whole process, applied the RMF myself in my previous job with the NIST CIO. So I have all of that operational experience and have gone through it. And so I always have in mind what is really happening in the trenches and whether or not something is reasonable for actual operational staff to be dealing with.
And candidly, the entire NIST FSMA team at one point did come from operations.
Yes, that's right.
Before we made dog food, we were eating the dog food.
Yes, we've eaten a lot of dog.
We've been watching the Twitter feed, so the good thing about the Twitter universe is that you get the real-time feedback from all of our customers out there. And so I did see that question. I think it was from Bill Ross.
I'm not naming names. I'm just reading the questions as they appear on my screen.
A good customer out there. So look, we live on the notion of transparency. A lot of our time, you may think it's just spent behind a desk doing standards and guidelines, but we are always out in the trenches with our customers. A lot of federal agencies, we are constantly out there and we listen to their concerns. And this is the wonderful part about working at NIST in an open and transparent environment. This is why we have our public review process, multiple iterations, so we can listen to your concerns, understand the effects in the operation, in the trenches, as Bill said in his tweet. We have to understand what that looks like. And again, most of us have come from that world at some point in time. In my case, I'm a lot older than Kelly and the other folks, but it was a long time ago. But we do have that recent experience, and we're out all the time listening to our concerns of our customers. So we hope that all of that interaction can feed back into a process that ends up giving you the kinds of products and services and tools and techniques and controls that you need to build good security, privacy, and supply chain risk programs.
We've also had interagency working groups too. So
how about two more questions before we end the webcast for today? First is about, where did it go? How do you apply the RMF for either a higher ed or small or medium business? There's a lot of our participants out there today that don't work for a federal agency and would like to leverage some of our guidance. What were your recommendations for how they take our suite of in-depth publications and use them?
Well, I think, as we've said earlier, everything in the RMF it can scale up or scale down. And we get this question a lot because there's no mistake about it. Cybersecurity and privacy, to do good programs, it's not easy. There is a significant investment, but nothing could be more important today for your business or your agency's survival. So my best advice is to take what we say in the RMF and try to scale it down, apply it to your specific organization, the type of system, the type of mission, the type of business you have, and the size of the organization. So I'll give you one quick example. We have one control in our CP family, contingency planning, that requires you to develop a contingency plan. Now that plan, if you were to go into DHS or one of our large federal agencies, may be 500 pages, and it may be very, very complicated and detailed. But if you take that same concept of a contingency plan and you go into a small or medium-sized company, that plan should scale down appropriately to the size and the complexity of that company. The same basic concept is in play. You want to have a plan. How are you going to react, whether it's contingency planning activities or incident response when something bad happens? You have to have a playbook of what are you going to do when things don't go right. That may be written on one page for a small business, or it may be 500 pages if it's DHS. But the concepts are always applicable in either case.
So there is a scaled down version. It's very, very scaled down, meant for people who have never done this before. And I don't remember the name of the publication. It's a NIST IR specific for small businesses. And it goes through the CSF kind of viewpoint. But if you look at it, it is this exact same thing, just like Ron is saying, it's the same process. That one is very scaled down for somebody, it gives examples of paper, paper forms that you can use, things like that. And there's also, recently NIST was tasked to help small businesses specifically on this and cybersecurity topics. And I know they're working heavily with that to get that started. So I'd keep your ears and eyes open.
So the publication is called Small Business Information Security, The Fundamentals. And the publication number is NIST IR 7621, Revision 1, and Celia is one of the co-authors. What a perfect plug. Well, that actually was a slightly longer answer than I was anticipating. We are at 3:17:25, and thank you for everyone that has stayed on the webcast well beyond the 3 o'clock hour. I know everyone has busy afternoons. Thank you all for joining us remotely. Thank you for the entire NIST team from Conference Services to AV Tech for making this event happen. And thank you to our panelists and speakers today for a very informative talk. If we were unable to answer your questions due to time that you submitted today via Twitter or email, we will be getting back to you in the next couple of weeks. Again, this webcast is being recorded and will be available for playback within 2 weeks. The slides are also available on the site where you originally registered. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Our emails and contact information are all on the slide shown up here. Have a wonderful afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you all soon. Thank you, guys.